What if I told you that one of the absolute richest artists in all of history lived like he was completely broke? Today, we're diving into the life of Michelangelo, a man whose genius was, well, it was truly divine, but it was matched only by his own personal misery.
Okay, let's just jump right into this paradox, because it's at the heart of everything. On one hand, you've got the legend, right? The world-famous genius, creating art that's literally priceless, and he was incredibly wealthy. But then, there's the man. He lived like a pauper, was known for being grumpy and lonely, and apparently slept in his clothes and boots. How do these two people exist in the same body? So, to even begin to understand this guy, we have to start with that central puzzle, the glaring contradiction of a man who had all the money in the world but chose to live in squalor.
And I'm not exaggerating when I say he was rich. We're talking about 50,000 gold florins. In today's money, that's roughly $7.5 million. For the Renaissance, this guy was a one-man financial powerhouse. He was loaded.
So what did he do with all that cash? Absolutely nothing. I mean, it's bizarre. He'd eat bread and a little wine just to survive, not for pleasure. He barely ever bathed. He avoided people like the plague. And that huge fortune, he just hoarded it. He never ever spent it on himself.
And he was totally self-aware about it. He told his biographer, Ascanio Condivi, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." See, this wasn't something that happened to him. This was a life he chose. And to figure out why, we got to go all the way back to the beginning.
So what could possibly make someone live like that? Well, as you're about to see, the roots of Michelangelo's complicated genius were really planted in his childhood, which was full of loss and a very weird connection to stone.
So picture this. He's just 6 years old when his mother dies. His father, who's obsessed with the family's social standing, sees his son's artistic talent as a complete embarrassment, something for common laborers. But then, at 13, he goes against his dad's wishes and becomes an apprentice. And just 2 years later, he's taken in by Lorenzo de' Medici, the most powerful man in Florence. Talk about a whirlwind.
But where did this incredible, almost supernatural talent come from? Well, if you ask Michelangelo, he'd tell you it wasn't some gift from God. You see, after his mother died, he was sent to live with a wet nurse whose husband was a stonecutter. And he famously joked that he sucked in the hammer and chisels with his wet nurse's milk. It just goes to show you how grounded, how earthy his view of his own incredible talent really was.
So you've got this troubled young man who basically feels like he was born to carve stone. How does he become, well, Michelangelo? Let's get to the masterpieces that made him a legend and look at the personal hell he went through to create them.
Okay, he's only 24. 24 years old, and he unveils this masterpiece, the Pietà. It's carved from a single piece of marble, and it's so breathtakingly beautiful, so perfect, that it makes him famous overnight. The entire world had never seen anything like it. Now this is where it gets interesting. Michelangelo almost never signed his work, but with the Pietà, he overheard some people saying another artist must have made it. He got so furious that in a fit of pride, he snuck into the basilica at night and carved his name in big letters right across Mary's sash. It's the only work he ever signed, and it tells you everything about his ego. So after that huge success in Rome, he goes back to Florence. The city is in political turmoil, a brand new republic trying to survive, and they need a symbol of their strength and their defiance. And so they commission Michelangelo to create the David.
But here's the kicker. The piece of marble they gave him was basically junk. Another artist had tried to work on it 40 years earlier and had totally botched it. Everyone considered this giant block of stone completely ruined. But not Michelangelo. He took on the challenge, and for 3 years he worked in total secrecy, carving his masterpiece out of this impossible stone. So at this point, he has conquered sculpture. He's the undisputed king. So naturally, Pope Julius II gives him a job he absolutely hates, painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo considered himself a sculptor, period. He thought painting was a lesser art. He was totally convinced it was a trap set by his rivals to watch him fail.
And what a task it was. We're talking 4 years of brutal, back-breaking labor. He was perched on scaffolding, his body twisted into painful positions, painting over 300 figures on a 500-square-meter ceiling. It was an absolutely monumental feat of endurance, and he did pretty much all of it by himself.
But here's the great irony of his life. While he's creating these iconic works that we still marvel at today, the one project he truly poured his heart into, the one he wanted to be his ultimate masterpiece, just kept falling apart.
It was this massive tomb for Pope Julius II. It ended up plaguing him for 40 years, constantly getting changed and interrupted. He called it the tragedy of the tomb.
Okay, so he was the most famous artist of his time, a living legend. But what about the man himself? Behind that tough, grumpy exterior was a person who was deeply lonely and just desperate for real human connection.
And in a life that was mostly solitary, two people really broke through. First, there was Vittoria Colonna. She was a poet, a noblewoman, and she became his spiritual confidant, his intellectual equal. And then there was Tommaso de Cavalieri, a handsome young nobleman who became the subject of Michelangelo's most passionate and, well, controversial love poems.
And these poems he wrote to Tommaso, they are not subtle. They are some of the most explicit and beautiful expressions of love for another man from that period. But for over 250 years, the world was never allowed to read them as he wrote them. In 1623, his grandnephew published them, but to protect the family's reputation, he changed all the male pronouns to female ones. An incredible act of censorship that completely rewrote history.
So as Michelangelo gets older, his art gets darker, more spiritual. And his final years are defined by one last huge controversy, a final battle between his artistic freedom and the rigid rules of the church.
Almost 30 years after he finished the ceiling, they call him back to the Sistine Chapel. He's in his 60s now, and this time he's not painting the creation of the world, he's painting its end. The Last Judgment is this terrifying, swirling vortex of bodies, completely different from the calm classical beauty of his earlier work. This is the art of an old man staring death in the face.
And the most controversial part? The sheer amount of nudity. We're talking a muscular, beardless Christ, naked angels, everyone. The church was absolutely scandalized. And in a final, awful insult, after Michelangelo died, they hired one of his own students to go in and paint drapery or fig leaves over many of the figures, a complete defacement of his work.
In the end, the man who gave the world so much profound beauty died a pretty lonely, bitter old man. He publicly humiliated Leonardo da Vinci. He accused his other rival, Raphael, of being a plagiarist. He outlived his few friends and was left pretty much alone with his art, a solitary genius in a world that could only admire him from a distance.
So, all of this leaves us with one big, kind of uncomfortable question. He created some of the most sublime beauty the world has ever known, but he lived a life of profound personal suffering to do it. So, was it worth it? I'll let you be the judge of that.